The badge is supposed to mean something. The person wearing it has taken an oath, passed background checks, and been handed authority that most people will never hold. The power to arrest, to investigate, to access information that can determine whether a criminal walks free or goes to prison. For every officer on this list, that authority was for sale. These were not patrol cops caught taking a small bribe. These were detectives, senior investigators, a chief of detectives, and federal agents who made deliberate choices to hand everything their position gave them directly to organized crime. Some did it for decades before anyone caught them. Some were caught early and put back on the job anyway. Today, we are covering 10 of the most corrupt law enforcement officers ever found working for the mob. Case 1. Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. The Mafia Cops Force. New IPD. Family. Lucchese crime family. Status. Both convicted 2006. Sentenced to life plus 100 years, Ippolito, and life plus 80 years, Caracappa, in 2009. Louis Ippolito joined the New York Police Department in 1969. He rose to the rank of detective by 1977 and spent most of his career working out of Brooklyn. By the time he retired from the force in 1990, he had received 11 department commendations and was considered one of the more productive officers the department had produced. Stephen Caracappa joined the new YPD the same year, 1969, made detective, and eventually helped build the department's organized crime homicide unit, the squad specifically created to investigate murders connected to the mob. What neither man included in their personnel files was the other life they were living. Ippolito's father was Ralph Ippolito, a soldier in the Gambino crime family who went by the nickname Fat the Gangster. His uncle was James Ippolito, known as Jimmy the Clam, a Gambino captain who ran gambling and other rackets. Ippolito grew up around these men. When he applied to the NYPD in 1969, he wrote on his application that he had no relatives in organized crime. That was false. He had spent his entire childhood inside the world he claimed to have left behind. The first warning came in 1983. FBI agents raided a home in New Jersey connected to Rosario Gambino, a Sicilian heroin trafficker who was a distant relative of Gambino family boss Carlo Gambino. Inside, they found a folder of photocopied NYPD intelligence files. The pages carried Ippolito's fingerprints. He had personally signed the records log for the file back in December of that year, while federal investigators already had Rosario Gambino under active surveillance. The NYPD suspended Ippolito without pay. An internal review followed. He was then reinstated and kept his job. Caracappa had his own connections, quieter but just as real. He had grown up in Brooklyn as a close childhood friend of Thomas Bellotti, who became a top aide to Gambino boss Paul Castellano. By the early 1980s, federal authorities had already identified both detectives as Mafia associates, years before either man faced charges of any kind. The person who would eventually formalize their relationship with organized crime was Anthony Casso, the underboss of the Lucchese crime family. Casso was one of the most violent figures in New York's mob world at the time, personally involved in dozens of murders over his career. In 1985, he was introduced to the two detectives through a middleman named Bert Kaplan. Kaplan was a career criminal who had become friendly with Ippolito's cousin, Frank Santora Jr., while both were serving time in prison. Santora mentioned that his cousin was a detective willing to help the right people. Kaplan passed that along to Casso, and an arrangement was made. Starting in 1985, Casso paid both detectives $4,000 per month in cash. That monthly payment was the base rate for ongoing access. Access to the inside of the New York Police Department. They ran license plate checks for the mob. They identified confidential informants who were cooperating with federal investigators, passing their names back to Casso so he could have them killed. They pulled intelligence files on active law enforcement investigations and handed the contents to organized crime. Casso referred to the two detectives as his crystal ball. They were, in the most literal sense, his window into every move law enforcement was making against him. Over the full course of the arrangement, the two detectives were paid a total of approximately $375,000, a combination of the monthly salary and additional payments for specific contracted murders. In 1986, Casso needed a man named Israel Greenwald handled. Greenwald was a diamond dealer who had become entangled in a deal involving stolen treasury bonds that went badly for Kaplan. The detectives located him. Greenwald was murdered, and his body buried beneath the concrete floor of a garage in Linden, New Jersey. It would remain there for years. That same year, Casso survived an assassination attempt that he traced back to a Gambino associate named James Heidel. He wanted Heidel dead, and he wanted the detectives to deliver him. Ippolito and Caracappa went to Betty Heidel's home in Staten Island, identified themselves as police officers, and asked to speak with her son. She trusted them. James Heidel came out. The detectives took him, not to a precinct, but bound and delivered directly to Casso. Casso tortured him before killing him. Betty Heidel would not learn the full truth of what happened to her son until investigators told her nearly 2 decades later. Also in 1986, Caracappa pulled police files to locate a man named Nicholas Guido, who was connected to the attempt on Casso's life. The address he came back with was wrong. The Nicholas Guido who lived there had no connection to organized crime. On December 25, 1986, he was shot and killed after Christmas dinner at his mother's house. He was an innocent man who happened to share a name with someone Casso wanted dead. More followed. John Heidel, another member of the crew that had tried to kill Casso, was located and killed after his car was given a flat tire, a method commonly used to put a target in a helpless position. Anthony DeLappe was a Lucchese family captain who had moved to Los Angeles trying to stay out of Casso's reach. The detectives used police databases to help track him. He was killed in 1990. Bruno Facciolo, a Lucchese associate Casso believed had become an FBI informant, was killed in 1990. His body was found with a canary stuffed in his mouth. The symbolism was deliberate. On the evening of October 6, 1990, the two detectives pulled Edward Lino over on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn. Lino was a Gambino family soldier. One of the detectives shot him in his car. For that job alone, Casso paid the pair $65,000. All of this happened while both men were active NYPD personnel, collecting department paychecks, receiving commendations for their police work, and in Caracappa's case, running the Organized Crime Murder Investigation Squad. Ippolito retired from the force in 1990. He moved briefly to Los Angeles, attempted an acting career, and had a small, uncredited appearance in the 1990 film Goodfellas. In 1992, he published a memoir in which he described himself as an honest cop who had spent his career resisting the gravitational pull of the mob family he had been born into. Caracappa retired in 1992 on a disability pension. Both men then relocated to Las Vegas. Casso himself was the first to name them. In 1994, facing life in prison for his own crimes, he attempted to enter a cooperation agreement with federal investigators and gave detailed accounts of the arrangement, the payments, the murders, the names of the detectives. Prosecutors listened carefully and then concluded they could not build a case that relied primarily on the testimony of a man who had committed 36 murders. The case went cold for nearly a decade. The reinvestigation began in 2003 when NYPD detective Tommy Dades locked himself in a room at the Brooklyn District Attorney's office and began methodically working through phone logs and records tied to the organized crime unit where Caracappa had operated. One of the most important moments came when Betty Heidel contacted Dades. She told him that two NYPD detectives had shown up at her Staten Island home in 1986, asking for her son shortly before he vanished. She remembered their faces. Dades built the case from that conversation outward, eventually working with federal prosecutors to construct an indictment. The key that finally unlocked the prosecution was Burt Kaplan's decision to cooperate. Kaplan, then incarcerated on narcotics charges, agreed to testify. His account at trial ran over 2 full days. He described the structure of the arrangement in precise detail, how the payments were made, how requests were passed from Casso to the detectives, how the results came back. His testimony was specific enough to be verified against physical evidence, phone records, and witness accounts that investigators had gathered independently. In March 2005, DEA and FBI agents arrested both men as they walked into an Italian restaurant in Las Vegas called Piero's. Both immediately and publicly maintained their innocence. The trial took place in federal court in Brooklyn in 2006. Neither Ippolito nor Caracappa took the stand. Their defense attorneys attacked Kaplan's credibility, a convicted criminal making a deal to reduce his own exposure. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Both men were found guilty of racketeering, 8 counts of murder and conspiracy, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, money laundering, and narcotics offenses. The case then took a strange turn. The presiding federal judge threw out the racketeering convictions in June 2006, finding that the 5-year statute of limitations had expired on the primary charges. For a period of time, it appeared both men would walk free, despite being found guilty of 8 murders. In September 2008, the Federal Appeals Court reversed that ruling and reinstated the convictions, finding sufficient evidence that the conspiracy had continued well beyond the relevant cutoff period. On March 6, 2009, Luis Ippolito was sentenced to life in federal prison plus 100 additional years and fined more than $4 million. Stephen Caracappa received life plus 80 years and a fine of more than $4 million. Neither man would be eligible for parole under any circumstances. Stephen Caracappa died in federal custody on April 8, 2017, at the age of 74. Luis Ippolito remains imprisoned. New York City paid $18.4 million to settle lawsuits brought by 7 of the victims' families. Caracappa helped create the unit that was supposed to stop exactly what he spent years doing. Ippolito spent his career in a department that had already caught him once passing files to a Gambino family associate and put him back on the street anyway. The next case is in some ways more disturbing than this one, because while Ippolito and Caracappa were cops who got paid to work for the mob, the next man was a federal agent who had the full investigative power of the FBI in his hands, used it to dismantle the Italian Mafia in Boston, and simultaneously handed everything the mob needed to survive to an Irish gang boss he had been friends with since childhood. That relationship would cost multiple people their lives and produce one of the largest corruption payouts in FBI history. Case 2. John Connolly. John Connolly grew up in the Old Harbor housing project in South Boston. So did the Bulger family. Whitey Bulger was already running with a street gang in the neighborhood when Connolly was still a kid, and according to Connolly's own account, Bulger once chased away a group of older boys who were pushing him around. Connolly never forgot it. He went on to Boston College, joined the FBI in 1968, and spent his early career in Baltimore, San Francisco, and New York before getting transferred back to Boston in 1973. 2 years after that transfer, he sat down with Whitey Bulger and convinced him to become an informant. That meeting started a relationship that would eventually send Connolly to prison for the rest of his life. The FBI's reasoning at the time was straightforward. The Bureau had identified the Italian Mafia, specifically the Patriarca crime family of New England, as its primary organized crime target. Bulger led the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish outfit based in South Boston that was a separate operation from the Mafia and had its own conflicts with them. Making Bulger an informant gave the FBI a source inside the criminal world who could provide intelligence on the Patriarca family. Connolly used that logic to justify the arrangement to his supervisors. What he did not tell them was how far he intended to take it. From 1975 onward, Connolly and Bulger operated as something closer to partners than handler and informant. Connolly fed Bulger information about FBI investigations targeting the Winter Hill Gang. He warned Bulger when the Bureau was getting close. He falsified FBI reports to keep Bulger and his associate Stephen Flemmi looking valuable as informants, while concealing the full extent of their criminal activity. He passed along the names of people within Bulger's world who were cooperating with law enforcement, informants whose identities the FBI was legally required to protect. At least some of those people were subsequently murdered. Bulger and Flemmi paid Connolly $235,000 over the course of their relationship. With that money, Connolly bought a 27-foot boat, 2 condominiums, land in Chatham on Cape Cod, and built a house on that land. An IRS agent laid out those purchases in precise detail during testimony at Connolly's trial. On a federal agent's salary, none of it was explainable. Connolly's supervisor at the FBI's Boston office, John Morris, was also taking money. Morris accepted cash and gifts from Bulger and Flemmi and assisted Connolly in protecting them. Morris was eventually granted immunity in exchange for testifying against Connolly. He faced no criminal conviction despite admitting his own involvement. The arrangement began falling apart in 1995 when details of the FBI's protection of Bulger started surfacing publicly. Bulger had already been tipped off by then, reportedly by Connolly, that federal charges were coming, and he fled Boston in January 1995. He would not be caught for another 16 years. In 1999, federal prosecutors indicted Connolly on charges including racketeering, obstruction of justice, and lying to investigators. His 2002 trial in federal court in Boston produced a conviction on racketeering and related charges. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. That was not the end of it. In 1981, a businessman named Roger Wheeler, who owned World Highlight, a Florida-based gambling company, had been shot once in the head in the parking lot of a Tulsa country club after a round of golf. Winter Hill Gang hitman John Martirano pulled the trigger. The motive was money. The gang believed Wheeler had discovered they were skimming from the company's profits. In 1982, Wheeler's accountant, John Callahan, who had ties to the gang and knew too much about the Wheeler murder, was found shot dead in the trunk of a Cadillac at Miami International Airport. Martirano killed him too. What prosecutors established was that Connolly had told Bulger and Flemmi that Callahan was being investigated by the FBI and could implicate them in Wheeler's death. That warning was what triggered the decision to kill Callahan. In 2005, Florida prosecutors indicted Connolly on murder charges connected to Callahan's death. In 2008, a Miami jury convicted him of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 40 years in prison to run consecutive to his federal sentence. Combined with the 10-year federal sentence, Connolly faced 50 years total. A Florida appeals court later overturned the murder conviction on statute of limitations grounds in 2014, a decision that was itself later reversed. The legal proceedings ran on for years. In 2021, a Florida Medical Release Board approved Connolly's release to home confinement after he was diagnosed with cancer and given less than a year to live. He was 80 years old. He went home to Massachusetts. Whitey Bulger was arrested in Santa Monica, California in June 2011 after 16 years as a fugitive. He was convicted in 2013 of 11 murders and racketeering. He was killed by fellow inmates at a federal prison in West Virginia in October 2018. He was 89 years old. The damage Connolly's protection enabled is not easily summarized in a single number. Multiple people were murdered because he passed their names to Bulger. Prosecutors used the phrase that he became a Winter Hill Gang operative masquerading as an FBI agent. His supervisors knew enough to be suspicious and did nothing. The Boston FBI's handling of Bulger and Flemmi became one of the most studied examples of institutional corruption in American law enforcement history. While Connolly at least operated under the cover story that he was targeting a larger enemy, the next man on this list had no such justification. He was the chief of detectives for the city of Chicago, one of the most powerful law enforcement positions in the country, and he used that position to run a robbery crew for the mob for over a decade while collecting 2 paychecks. Case 3. William Hanhart, the mob's man at the top of Chicago PD force. Chicago Police Department, Chief of Detectives / Deputy Superintendent. Family, Chicago outfit. Status, pleaded guilty 2001, sentenced to 11 years and 9 months federal prison. William Hanhart joined the Chicago Police Department in 1953. Over the next 33 years, he worked his way up through the ranks until he held 2 of the most senior positions in the department, Chief of Detectives and Deputy Superintendent. He was, by any external measure, exactly what a career cop was supposed to look like. He was also, according to FBI records, a member of the Chicago outfit's Grand Avenue crew for virtually the entire time he wore a badge. When Hanhart retired in 1986, he did not slow down. He assembled a theft crew and spent the next decade running one of the most methodical and sophisticated robbery operations in American criminal history, targeting traveling jewelry salesmen across the country and stealing tens of millions of dollars in gems, watches, and cash, while paying a portion of the proceeds back to the Chicago mob as a street tax. The operation had roots that predated Hanhart's retirement. FBI records show that a man named James D'Antonio had begun building the framework of the crew as early as 1973. D'Antonio was a professional thief with connections to organized crime, and he brought Hanhart into a structure that already had methods and targets. When D'Antonio died in a car accident in 1993, Hanhart was running things entirely himself, with a core group of trusted associates that included a man named Joseph Basinski as his primary thief on the ground. The crew's approach was not random. They identified high-end traveling jewelry salesmen, men who moved from city to city carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars in merchandise, and conducted surveillance on them for weeks or months before making a move. They gathered personal information, tracked daily routines, mapped out hotel stays, and identified the exact moments when a target would be most vulnerable. They used lockpicks, hotel key duplicates, car keys, garage door openers, listening devices, and cameras. When FBI agents eventually searched a location connected to the crew, they found 3,000 separate pieces of paper documenting the identities and habits of salesmen across the country. They also found smoke grenades, a small flash device designed to temporarily blind people, and bulletproof vests. Some of the intelligence came from inside the Chicago Police Department itself. Hanhart used connections with active officers, some of whom still called him Chief, to run license plates and gather information on targets. A private investigator connected to Hanhart repeatedly provided confidential credit histories of jewelry salesmen to help the crew identify the most valuable targets. The thefts were precise and profitable. In October 1984, the crew's first documented job took place in Glendale, Wisconsin, where they stole more than $300,000 in high-end watches from a car parked outside a hotel. In the fall of 1986, they stole $500,000 in gold Rolex watches in Monterey, California. In 1992, they walked out of the master safe at a Columbus, Ohio Hyatt Regency Hotel with $1.5 million in cash from a safety deposit box. In 1995, they took nearly $1 million in uncut diamonds from a jewelry company representative's Milwaukee hotel room safe. In one instance, Hanhart pistol-whipped a salesman in a Brookfield, Wisconsin hotel room before cleaning out his merchandise. The FBI was watching. Agents photographed Hanhart and Basinski in a Northwest Indiana restaurant parking lot in October 1996 as they used a duplicate key to remove cases of watches worth $58,000 from a salesman's car trunk while the man was inside eating lunch. Basinski actually stopped, lifted the cases to check their weight, then put them back and returned to the restaurant. The crew came back for the final score later. That surveillance photograph became one of the central pieces of physical evidence against them. The investigation was eventually broken open when D'Antonio's nephew came forward in 1999 and handed authorities 27 boxes of his uncle's files on the entire operation. The crew was indicted in October 2000. In October 2001, Hanhart attempted suicide on the day he was supposed to appear in court for his arraignment. A federal appeals court later ruled this could not be counted as obstruction of justice, writing that an attempted suicide cannot be considered an obstruction of court proceedings. He recovered and entered his plea. He pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and interstate theft. His sentencing hearing lasted 4 days. Prosecutors told the court that Hanhart had been in the mob's pocket for virtually his entire police career. FBI records described him as belonging to the outfit's Grand Avenue crew. His robbery ring paid a street tax to Joseph Lombardo, known as Joey the Clown, who served as the Chicago outfit's consigliere. During the Family Secrets trial in 2007, testimony emerged that Hanhart had shaken down a mob crew leader in the 1960s for monthly protection payments. He was described not as someone who fell into corruption late in his career, but as someone who had been embedded in organized crime from the beginning. He was sentenced to 11 years and 9 months in federal prison. He was released from a federal correctional facility in Indiana in July 2011. He was the highest-ranking Chicago Police Department official ever convicted of a felony. He continued drawing his police pension, more than $70,000 per year, throughout his incarceration because he had joined the department 2 years before a rule requiring pension forfeiture upon felony conviction took effect. Hanhart died on December 30, 2016, at Highland Park Hospital in Illinois. He was 88. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that follows involved a man who never ran a theft ring and never took a direct payment for a murder. What he did was spend 22 years as a Chicago police officer while simultaneously building and protecting a cocaine empire that ran from Miami to Chicago, and then threatened to have the federal prosecutor who caught him killed. Case 4. Joseph Mijanowski, Chicago's most corrupt cop force. Joseph Mijanowski joined the Chicago Police Department in the early 1980s and was assigned to the Gang Crimes Unit, where he spent the next 16 years building a reputation as one of the most productive officers in the division. He had high arrest numbers, an extensive network of street informants, and the kind of detailed knowledge of gang operations that comes from years of working the same neighborhoods. His supervisors considered him an asset. What they did not know was that from at least 1985 onward, he was using everything the department had given him: his badge, his access, his informants, his knowledge of police operations, to run his own criminal organization on the side. The arrangement began with protection. A drug trafficking ring operating between Miami and Chicago approached Mijanowski and offered him $12,000 per month to keep their operations safe from law enforcement. He accepted. He used his position in the Gang Crimes Unit to warn them about upcoming raids, identify undercover officers working in their territory, and describe undercover police vehicles so their people could spot surveillance. He passed along the names of confidential informants who were feeding information to investigators. Within a year of taking the protection money, he had moved from contractor to operator. He took over the ring's Chicago distribution himself, cutting out the people he had been protecting and running the cocaine operation directly. The network he built from there was extensive. He worked with at least 4 different street gangs simultaneously, using them as distribution channels. He supplied the Imperial gangsters with a dozen semi-automatic pistols and revolvers to use in their street war against the Spanish Cobras. He personally delivered crack cocaine to customers, on at least one occasion driving an unmarked Chicago police vehicle to make the drop. He robbed drug dealers who were not part of his network, seizing their product and cash and selling it himself. In one documented instance, a gang member tipped him off that a rival dealer had 400 pounds of marijuana stored in an apartment building basement. Mijanowski seized it, split it with his source, and his associate sold his 200-pound share for approximately $80,000. He also fixed cases. Prosecutors established that he accepted more than $40,000 in payments to have criminal charges dropped against drug traffickers. He used his standing as a police officer and his relationships with people inside the court system to make cases disappear. In at least one instance, he warned a murder suspect about the identities of witnesses in the case against him. The FBI opened an investigation and placed him under surveillance. For months, agents watched and documented. They observed him in meetings with gang members and drug suppliers. They recorded phone calls. They photographed transactions. In 1998, a federal grand jury indicted him along with 11 co-defendants on charges of distributing more than 220 pounds of powder and crack cocaine between 1995 and 1998. As the case built, Mijanowski made clear how far he was willing to go. He made threats against Brian Nettles, the lead federal prosecutor handling his case, stating that he intended to have Nettles killed. That threat was documented and later cited at sentencing. His trial ran for 3 months. 10 co-defendants pleaded guilty before it reached a verdict. The jury found Mijanowski guilty on all 10 counts against him, including racketeering conspiracy, narcotics conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, robbery, and kidnapping. He was 48 years old when the verdict was read. He stood with his hands clasped, expressionless. His wife and children were in the courtroom. At sentencing in January 2003, U.S. District Judge Blanche Manning told him directly what she thought of what he had done. She described him as having used his position to infect a trusting society and said she had a heavy heart in handing down the sentence. She sentenced him to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Nettles, the prosecutor he had threatened, held Mijanowski's badge up in the courtroom and told the judge it had not been a badge of honor or dedication. It had been camouflage. The broader damage he caused extended well beyond his own crimes. Because he had used his position to frame people who got in his way, convictions he had been involved in came under scrutiny years after his imprisonment. In 2022, a Cook County judge vacated the murder convictions of brothers Juan and Rosendo Hernandez, who had been convicted in 2001 of a 1997 murder. The judge found that Mijanowski had suspected the brothers of stealing marijuana from one of his drug dealers and had instructed fellow detective Reynaldo Guevara to frame them. The brothers served 26 years in prison before their convictions were overturned. They were not the only ones. In 2021, when Mijanowski applied for a sentence reduction under the First Step Act, U.S. District Judge Virginia Kendall denied the request. She wrote that his criminal behavior was extremely serious and had harmed his community in ways that went far beyond what the sentencing documents could fully capture. She noted that he had led a double life and managed to deceive even those closest to him. She wrote that even if he was genuinely remorseful, the court had to consider the need to deter others from doing what he had done. He remained in federal prison, serving his life sentence without parole. U.S. Attorney Scott Lassar, who announced the original indictment, described him as the most corrupt police officer ever prosecuted in the Northern District of Illinois. Not the most corrupt in a precinct, not the most corrupt in a unit. The most corrupt officer the federal system in that district had ever prosecuted. Case 5. Hector Rosario. Bought by the Bonanno family force. Nassau County Police Department, 15-year veteran detective. Family:
Bonanno. Crime family status: convicted.
March 2025. Hector Rosario spent 15 years as a detective with the Nassau County Police Department on Long Island, New York. By the time federal investigators started looking at him seriously, he had already spent years accepting cash from members of the Bonanno crime family in exchange for doing things that put people's lives at risk and compromised active federal investigations. He was convicted in March 2025, making him the most recent case on this list and one of the clearest examples of what it looks like when a working detective decides his loyalty belongs to the mob.
The broader operation that eventually pulled Rosario into the open started with an unusual arrangement between two of New York's 5 crime families. The Bonanno family and the Genovese family, which generally kept to separate territories and separate business, struck a deal to jointly operate a backroom gambling den inside a gelato shop on Long Island. The agreement was that they would split the proceeds. The agreement did not hold. A dispute broke out between the two families over the money, and that dispute escalated into a feud that drew federal attention. Federal investigators from the Eastern District of New York began building a case against both families. The gambling operation was running out of multiple front businesses: a coffee bar, a soccer club, a shoe repair shop, with participants carrying nicknames like Joe Fish, Sal the Shoemaker, and Joe Box. 9 people connected to the operation were ultimately charged, with Rosario the only law enforcement officer among them. Rosario had been collecting cash payments from Bonanno family members for years. In exchange for that money, he gave them what a detective could give: information. He tipped off a mob associate that the associate was under active federal investigation, allowing that person time to adjust their behavior and potentially destroy or conceal evidence before investigators could act. He also accessed law enforcement databases to look up the home address of a person he believed was cooperating with federal authorities as a witness. Looking up that address served no legitimate investigative purpose. The only use for a witness's home address, in the hands of someone working for the mob, is to allow the mob to find that person. The staged raid was a separate and particularly brazen act. Rosario organized what appeared to be a police operation against a covert casino being run by the Genovese family. Not because law enforcement had authorized or requested it, but as a favor to his Bonanno handlers who were in the middle of their dispute with the Genovese side. He used the authority and appearance of a legitimate police action to strike at a rival criminal operation on behalf of the family paying him. In 2020, FBI agents investigating the Bonanno and Genovese gambling activity interviewed Rosario directly. He told them he had no information about organized crime activity in the area and no knowledge of any illegal gambling operations. Both statements were false. He knew exactly what was happening because he had been part of it. Those lies formed the basis of the federal charge that ultimately produced his conviction. Rosario was fired from the Nassau County Police Department in 2022 after the investigation became known to the department. He was 51 years old at the time of his conviction. He had been a police officer for 15 years. At trial, his defense attorneys argued that the case rested almost entirely on testimony from mob members who were cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for leniency on their own charges. People with obvious reasons to say whatever the government needed them to say. The jury convicted him of lying to the FBI. He was acquitted on the obstruction of justice charge after his lawyers successfully argued he may not have fully understood the scope of what the federal agents were investigating at the time of the interview. U.S. Attorney John Durham, whose office prosecuted the case, described Rosario as a corrupt detective who chose loyalty to the mob over the public he was sworn to protect. Nassau County District Attorney Ann Donnelly said he had disgracefully compromised the work of his fellow detectives by tipping off a target and then lied to federal agents as the investigation closed in on him. Leslie Bakshies, acting FBI Assistant Director in charge of the Bureau's New York field office, said Rosario had allowed himself to be bought by the mob to lie during a federal investigation into the Bonanno family's illegal gambling operations. The conviction on the lying charge carries a potential sentence of up to 5 years in federal prison. At the time this script was written, sentencing had not yet taken place. What makes Rosario's case land differently from the others on this list is not the scale. Compared to 8 murders or decades of protection given to a gang boss or a citywide cocaine empire, a gambling dispute and a few lies to federal agents may seem smaller. What makes it significant is the date. This happened now. The conviction came down in March 2025. The pattern that produced Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa in the 1980s, John Connolly in the 1970s through 1990s, and William Hanhart across 3 decades. That pattern has not ended. Men with badges are still choosing the mob over the law, and federal prosecutors are still having to go looking for them. The case that follows involves a man who operated at a completely different level of law enforcement, but caused damage that was just as far-reaching. A Massachusetts State Police lieutenant who spent years inside the unit responsible for monitoring organized crime, while quietly passing everything he learned directly to Whitey Bulger's inner circle. Case 6. Richard Schneiderhan, the State Police mole for Whitey Bulger. Force: Massachusetts State Police. Lieutenant, Attorney General's Organized Crime Unit. Gang: Winter Hill Gang, Whitey Bulger. Status: convicted March 2003, conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Richard Schneiderhan grew up in Roxbury, Massachusetts, in the same neighborhood as the Flemmi brothers, Stephen, Vincent, and Michael. He idolized Stephen Flemmi as a child and maintained a close friendship with him into adulthood. That friendship, sustained over decades while Schneiderhan built a career in law enforcement and Flemmi built a career in organized crime, would eventually prove catastrophic for the federal investigations designed to bring the Winter Hill Gang down. Schneiderhan served in the Marine Corps, fought in the Korean War, and joined the Boston Police Department after his honorable discharge in 1955. He transferred to the Massachusetts State Police in 1959. From 1968 to 1978, he worked inside the Attorney General's Organized Crime Unit, rising to the position of Chief Intelligence Officer. That title meant exactly what it sounds like. He was the senior person responsible for gathering, managing, and protecting sensitive intelligence on organized crime activity in Massachusetts. He had access to surveillance operations, wiretap intelligence, informant identities, and the details of active investigations targeting some of the most dangerous criminal figures in New England. Stephen Flemmi, his childhood friend, had become a high-ranking member of the Winter Hill Gang alongside Whitey Bulger. Flemmi was simultaneously operating as a top-level FBI informant, a status that gave him and Bulger significant protection from federal prosecution, while they continued running extortion, drug trafficking, and murder operations across eastern Massachusetts. Schneiderhan knew what Flemmi was. He passed him information anyway. The access Schneiderhan provided helped the Winter Hill Gang stay ahead of state-level investigations targeting them. He used his position inside the organized crime unit to feed intelligence outward to people who had no legal right to it. Whether he received direct financial payments for doing this was investigated and never conclusively proven in court. What was proven was that he deliberately passed sensitive law enforcement intelligence to a man he knew to be a senior organized crime figure, and that he did it repeatedly over an extended period. The act that directly led to his conviction was specific. The FBI placed telephone surveillance on the phone lines used by Whitey Bulger's brothers. William Bulger, a prominent Massachusetts politician who served as president of the Massachusetts Senate, and other family members. Schneiderhan learned about that surveillance. He then warned Kevin Weeks, Whitey Bulger's deputy and one of his most trusted associates, that the brothers' phones were being monitored. That warning allowed the gang to adjust how they communicated,
avoiding the surveillance operation entirely. The significance of that warning went beyond its immediate practical effect. It told Bulger's organization that federal law enforcement was trying to reach Bulger through his family. It gave them time to adjust, and it confirmed that someone inside state law enforcement was watching out for them. Bulger's associates later made clear how much they valued Schneiderhan's access.
Kevin Weeks stated that Schneiderhan was considered more valuable to the gang than John Connolly, the FBI agent who spent years protecting Bulger from federal prosecution and was eventually convicted of racketeering and murder-related charges. That assessment speaks to how much damage a single compromised officer in the right position can do. After Flemmi was imprisoned in 1999, Schneiderhan maintained contact with both Flemmi and Weeks. That continued contact drew the attention of investigators already looking into the broader corruption scandal surrounding Bulger and the FBI's Boston office. Schneiderhan was called before a grand jury. In letters to his son Eric written around this period, Schneiderhan had referred to someone only as Paul, indicating that if legal trouble came, Eric should contact this person. When Eric told the grand jury he was unsure whether Paul was a code name for Flemmi, he was himself indicted for perjury. He was later found not guilty at trial. Schneiderhan was convicted on March 19, 2003, of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Two co-defendants, his brother-in-law and his niece, who had assisted in warning associates about the FBI's telephone surveillance, pleaded guilty to their own roles and were sentenced to 1 year of custody each. Schneiderhan was sent to the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. He was released on October 4, 2006. After his conviction, the Massachusetts State Board of Retirement ruled that the disability pension Schneiderhan had been collecting since his 1984 retirement should continue. The board's position was that because the crimes he was convicted of were committed after his retirement from active service, the pension could not be stripped on those grounds. He continued collecting it until his death on September 16, 2015. What Schneiderhan represents in the broader context of the Bulger scandal is something that receives less attention than the FBI angle, but is equally important. The corruption that allowed Bulger to operate for so long was not limited to one federal agency or one compromised agent. It ran through multiple layers of law enforcement simultaneously: federal, state, and local, and each compromised layer reinforced the others. Connolly protected Bulger from inside the FBI. Schneiderhan protected him from inside the state police. Both men knew Bulger through personal relationships that predated their law enforcement careers, and both allowed those relationships to define where their real loyalties sat. The next case is bigger in scale than any single officer or any single informant arrangement. In the early 1970s, a federal investigation into the New York Police Department's elite narcotics unit found that corruption had not just touched the unit, it had consumed it entirely. Of the 70 detectives who made up the Special Investigations Unit, 52 were indicted. The investigation exposed a world where heroin from major drug busts was being stolen from police evidence rooms and resold, where organized crime paid directly for protection, and where the most celebrated drug case in American history had been systematically looted by the officers who made it. Case 7. The French Connection.
CU Detectives, the Narcotics Bureau Mob Force. New York PD Special Investigations Unit, SIU, Narcotics Bureau. Connected to multiple Mafia families and organized crime networks. Status: 52 of 70 SIU detectives indicted following the Knapp Commission investigations, 1972. The Special Investigations Unit was the new IPD's most elite narcotics squad. Its detectives had city-wide jurisdiction, minimal supervision, and direct access to the highest levels of the city's drug underworld. They were selected for the unit because they were considered the best the department had: aggressive, street-smart, capable of building cases against major suppliers that uniformed officers and ordinary detectives could not reach.
By the early 1970s, a federal investigation had established that a significant portion of the unit had been operating as a criminal enterprise for years, using the authority of the badge to steal drugs, collect bribes from organized crime, and resell narcotics back onto the same streets they were paid to clean up. The Knapp Commission was formed in May 1970 by New York City Mayor John Lindsay, following public revelations about widespread corruption inside the NYPD, brought forward by two officers, Frank Serpico and David Dirk. Serpico had been documenting and reporting corruption within the department for years before going public. The commission, named after its chairman, Judge Whitman Knapp, investigated corruption across the entire department, but found its most disturbing material inside the narcotics units, and specifically inside the SIU. The commission's final report drew a distinction between two categories of corrupt officer. Grass eaters were officers who accepted small payments, gratuities from local businesses, cash from gamblers, minor bribes, largely because the culture around them made refusal socially difficult. Meat eaters were different. Meat eaters aggressively pursued corruption. They sought out opportunities to extort, steal, and profit. They did not drift into corruption. They chose it and built systems around it. The SIU, at its worst, was full of meat eaters. What the unit's detectives had access to was extraordinarily valuable. They handled major drug seizures. They managed evidence. They ran informants who were embedded in organized crime networks connected to multiple Mafia families across the city. They knew which operations were under surveillance and which were not. All of that information had a market price, and enough members of the unit were willing to sell it. The clearest example of what the SIU's corruption produced involves the French Connection case. In 1962, NYPD detectives Eddie Egan and Sonny Grosso made what was, at the time, the largest drug seizure in American history, intercepting a major heroin shipment connected to a French trafficking network. The case became famous and was later turned into an Academy Award-winning film. The heroin seized as evidence was stored in the NYPD's property room. Years later, when investigators went to account for it, a substantial portion was gone. It had disappeared from inside a secure police facility. It was widely believed within law enforcement circles to have been stolen by corrupt officers and resold. It was never recovered. The federal investigation that developed alongside the Knapp Commission relied heavily on one SIU detective who agreed to cooperate, Robert Lucy. Lucy had been inside the unit and had participated in corruption himself. He approached federal prosecutors and proposed something broader than simply confessing his own conduct. He argued that the corruption in New York was not limited to the police department, but ran through the entire criminal justice system, corrupt lawyers, fixers, and judges, as well as officers. He proposed going undercover to document the full scope of it. Federal prosecutors, including a young Rudy Giuliani who was working as an assistant U.S. attorney at the time, agreed. Lucy spent nearly 2 years wearing a wire, recording conversations with corrupt officers, defense attorneys, and others connected to the compromised system. The operation was known to only a small number of people inside law enforcement. His work produced 52 indictments among the 70 detectives who made up the SIU. The unit was disbanded entirely as a result. Some of Lucy's former colleagues and friends were among those indicted. Several committed suicide as the investigation closed in on them. Lucy continued working for the department after the investigation concluded, moving to the Internal Affairs Division and the Police Academy before retiring in 1981 after 20 years of service. The Knapp Commission's final report was issued in December 1972. It found that corruption within the NYPD was not a matter of isolated individuals making bad choices, but reflected systemic failures, inadequate supervision, a culture of silence, and command structures that either ignored corruption or actively benefited from it. The report made specific recommendations, including holding commanders accountable for what happened within their units, creating field offices of the Internal Affairs Division in all precincts,
and requiring regular reporting on conditions that historically produced corruption. Those recommendations were implemented to varying degrees.
The department changed. Supervision tightened. Internal affairs expanded. But the structural pressures that had produced the SIU, officers with access to drugs and money and minimal oversight, did not disappear simply because a commission had documented them. 14 years after the Knapp Commission published its findings, a group of officers in a single Brooklyn precinct demonstrated exactly that. What happened at the 77th precinct starting in the mid-1980s was in some ways a smaller version of what the SIU had been. A group of officers operating inside a broken system, stealing drugs from dealers, reselling them, and running extortion operations in the neighborhoods they were supposed to protect. But the way it was uncovered, and the way it spread through an entire precinct house, made it a landmark case in its own right. It was the largest NYPD corruption scandal to emerge between the Knapp Commission and the investigation that followed it, and it forced the department to confront the fact that the lessons of 1972 had not been learned as thoroughly as anyone had claimed. Case 8. The Buddy Boys, 77th Precinct, Brooklyn, 1986. Force, NYPD, 77th Precinct, Brooklyn, connected to drug dealers and organized crime networks. Status, 13 officers indicted, multiple convicted. The largest NYPD corruption scandal between the Knapp Commission and the Mullen Commission. The 77th Precinct covered the Crown Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn. In the mid-1980s, it was one of the most difficult assignments in the department, a high crime area during the peak of the crack epidemic, understaffed, under-resourced, and saturated with drug activity that officers encountered every single shift. The conditions inside the precinct house were not much better than the conditions outside it. Supervision was loose, accountability was thin, and a group of officers had decided at some point that investigators were never fully able to pinpoint that the rules they were supposed to enforce did not apply to them. The operation the officers were running was straightforward. They were kicking in the doors of drug dealers, taking their drugs and their cash, and reselling the stolen narcotics back into the same streets they patrolled. They were also running extortion operations within the precinct, demanding payments from people in the neighborhood in exchange for being left alone. They were not doing any of this quietly or carefully. By the time the investigation caught up with them, the corruption had become so embedded in the precinct's daily functioning that it was practically institutional. The group of officers involved called themselves the Buddy Boys. The name itself said something about how they understood what they were doing, not as a criminal conspiracy that needed to be hidden and compartmentalized, but as a social arrangement between men who trusted each other and had agreed to operate by different rules than the department officially sanctioned. That degree of comfort, that level of open internal organization, was what made the case significant beyond the crimes themselves. In December 1986, 11 officers from the 77th Precinct were arrested. The arrest was the result of an investigation that had been building for some time, involving surveillance, informants, and the patient documentation of specific thefts and extortion incidents. The arrests were made publicly and immediately became one of the biggest law enforcement stories in the city. Special State Prosecutor Charles Hines was appointed to present the evidence to a grand jury and manage the prosecution. By the time the indictments were complete, 13 officers had been charged. The fallout for the precinct itself was total. Every officer assigned to the 77th, nearly 200 people, was transferred out of the precinct and reassigned to other Brooklyn commands. The only officer permitted to remain was a union delegate. The precinct house did not simply lose its corrupt officers, it lost its entire roster. The department essentially acknowledged that the corruption had spread far enough through the command that no one currently assigned there could be confidently cleared and left in place. The transfers created their own problems. Officers who had been working in a corrupt environment
were now distributed across other Brooklyn precincts, carrying whatever habits and attitudes they had developed. Whether those individuals continued to engage in corrupt behavior in their new assignments was a question the department did not fully answer publicly,
and one that would resurface as later investigations examined how corruption spread through the NYPD as a whole, rather than staying contained within single commands. What the Buddy Boys case established, in terms the department could not ignore, was that the Knapp Commission's reforms had not produced a corruption-proof institution. 14 years after the SIU had been dismantled and 52 detectives indicted, a group of uniformed officers in a Brooklyn precinct had built an organized theft and extortion operation that ran for long enough to compromise an entire command. The conditions that made the SIU corrupt, access to drugs, minimal supervision, a culture that punished informing on fellow officers more harshly than it punished the corruption itself, had reproduced themselves at the street level. The New York Times published a corruption timeline in the period following the scandal that identified the Buddy Boys case as the first major corruption eruption inside the NYPD since the Knapp Commission. It would not be the last. The department instituted additional oversight measures in the aftermath. Commanders were reminded of their accountability for what happened inside their precincts. The language of reform was used extensively. And then, in the late 1980s, in a different Brooklyn precinct just a few miles away, a different group of officers began doing something that made the Buddy Boys look restrained by comparison. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Michael Dowd and the officers around him at the 75th Precinct were not simply stealing from drug dealers. They were working directly for a drug organization, providing armed protection for cocaine shipments, collecting weekly payments, and recruiting fellow officers into the arrangement. When the Mullen Commission was eventually formed to investigate what had happened, its findings were blunt. The NYPD's Internal Affairs Division had received multiple complaints about Dowd years before his arrest, and had done nothing meaningful with any of them. The corruption had not been invisible, it had been ignored. Case 9. The Mullen Commission. Officers: Henry Winter, Michael Dowd, et al. Force: NYPD 75th Precinct. Connected to Adam Diaz, Drug Organization, Organized Crime. Status: Michael Dowd, convicted, 1994, 14 years. Multiple officers convicted. Michael Dowd started stealing before he had any connection to organized crime. His first acts of corruption were simple and opportunistic, skimming cash from crime scenes, taking money from people he stopped on the street, pocketing whatever was available when no one was watching. He was working in the 75th Precinct in East New York, Brooklyn, one of the most dangerous and drug-saturated neighborhoods in the city during the crack epidemic of the 1980s. The precinct had one of the highest murder rates in the country. Officers were overwhelmed, underpaid, and operating in conditions that made oversight difficult and temptation constant. Dowd later described his first shakedown of a motorist he had pulled over as producing a rush once he realized he had gotten away with it. He kept going. The escalation was steady. Skimming became robbery. He began targeting drug dealers specifically, showing up at locations he knew through his work as a police officer, taking their drugs and their cash at gunpoint, and leaving. He recruited other officers. When his original partner, Henry Guevara, left the precinct after officers at a nearby command were arrested in the 77th Precinct scandal, Dowd was assigned a new partner, Kenneth Urell, who had a drinking problem and was already struggling with the pressures of working in East New York. Dowd brought Urell into what he was doing. Urell later said he understood from early in the partnership that Dowd operated well outside the rules. The operation changed fundamentally when Dowd connected with Adam Diaz. Diaz ran a Dominican drug organization in East New York that used several supermarkets as fronts for cocaine trafficking. The operation was substantial. Diaz was responsible for distributing large quantities of cocaine throughout the neighborhood and had the infrastructure and violence to protect it.
What he needed was law enforcement cover. Dowd provided it. He and Urel began working directly for the Diaz organization, providing information about upcoming police operations, identifying undercover officers working in the area, warning the organization when raids were being planned, and in some cases, providing physical security for the operation. In exchange, they were paid $8,000 per week. That weekly payment was not supplemental income for Dowd. It was his primary financial reality. On a police officer's salary of roughly $600 per week in the late 1980s, Dowd was taking home more than 13 times his official pay from a cocaine trafficking organization. He bought a house, he drove a Corvette, he purchased property. He lived in a way that was visibly inconsistent with what a patrol officer could afford, and none of it triggered meaningful scrutiny from his department for years. The Internal Affairs Division of the NYPD received complaints about Dowd. This is among the most damning findings of the investigation that followed his arrest. Not simply that he was corrupt, but that the system designed to catch corrupt officers had been told about him and had failed to act. Complaints had been filed, tips had been submitted. None of them produced a serious investigation into what Dowd was doing.
The Mullen Commission, which was formed specifically in the wake of his arrest to examine what had gone wrong, found that internal affairs under the NYPD's existing structure was not effectively investigating active corruption. The commission found that the division focused heavily on minor rule violations and administrative misconduct, while systemic, organized corruption of the kind Dowd represented went largely unchecked. Dowd was not caught by the NYPD. He was caught by the Suffolk County Police Department. While Dowd and Urel had extended their operation beyond Brooklyn into Suffolk County on Long Island, distributing cocaine through a separate contact who lived there, Suffolk County detectives built a case against them independently. In May 1992, Dowd and Urel were arrested on drug trafficking charges. The arrest became front-page news across the city almost immediately, both because of the scale of what Dowd had been doing and because of the timing. It came in the immediate aftermath of the Rodney King verdict and the unrest that followed, a period when law enforcement credibility was already under severe public strain. Mayor David Dinkins appointed the Mullen Commission shortly after the arrests. The commission, led by Milton Mullen, spent 2 years investigating corruption across the NYPD. Its 1994 report found that the department's corruption problem was not limited to isolated individuals. It identified clusters of officers in multiple precincts who were engaged in organized theft, drug protection, and violence. It found that the department's internal oversight had been structured in ways that made it better at concealing corruption than at finding it. It recommended sweeping changes to how internal affairs operated and called for an independent external oversight body. Dowd testified before the Mullen Commission in 1993. His testimony was detailed, specific, and delivered without apparent remorse in the moment. He described the progression of his corruption methodically, from the first stolen cash to the weekly payments from Diaz. He was asked at one point why he had done it. He said the money was there, and he took it. In 1994, Dowd was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. He was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison and served approximately 12.5 years before his release. Urel pleaded guilty and served 12 years. Adam Diaz was convicted separately on drug charges. The 75th Precinct case sits at the end of a line that runs from the Knapp Commission through the Buddy Boys and forward. Each scandal documenting the same institutional failure, reproducing itself in different forms across different decades. Officers with access, minimal oversight, and proximity to drugs and money made the same choices, and the system around them repeatedly failed to stop them early enough to limit the damage. The final case on this list is different from everything that came before it. It does not involve a precinct, a unit, or a group of officers. It involves one FBI agent whose corruption did not produce weekly drug payments or stolen jewelry. It produced dead bodies, wrongful imprisonment for innocent men who spent decades in prison for crimes the FBI knew they did not commit, and a federal payout of over $100 million that stands as one of the most expensive consequences of law enforcement corruption in American history. Case 10. H. Paul Rico, the FBI agent who helped the mob kill. Force: FBI, Boston Field Office. Gang: Winter Hill Gang, connected to Patriarca crime family. Status: indicted for murder 2003. Died in custody January 2004 before trial. Legally unconvicted, but with documented criminal findings. Harold Paul Rico joined the FBI in 1951 and spent the next 24 years working organized crime cases out of the Boston field office. He was considered one of the Bureau's most effective agents in New England, skilled at recruiting informants, building cases against high-level targets, and penetrating criminal organizations that had resisted law enforcement for years. His work helped send Raymond Patriarca, the boss of the New England Mafia, to prison twice. He helped develop the methods of informant recruitment and electronic surveillance that became standard tools across the Bureau. By the time he retired in 1975, he had received recognition from every FBI director he had served under, starting with J. Edgar Hoover. He was also, according to court findings, congressional testimony, federal civil judgments, and the documented record of multiple criminal proceedings, a man who allowed 4 innocent people to go to prison for a murder he knew they did not commit, and who later allegedly helped organized crime figures locate and kill a businessman in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The first set of facts is not disputed. In 1965, a small-time criminal named Edward Deegan was murdered in a Chelsea, Massachusetts alley. The killing was carried out by Vincent Flemmi, the younger brother of Stephen Flemmi, along with associates. Rico knew this. The FBI had intelligence on who had actually committed the murder. Instead of allowing that intelligence to produce an accurate prosecution, Rico and his partner Dennis Condon allowed a man named Joseph Barboza, a violent enforcer and FBI informant, to take the stand and commit perjury. Barboza testified that 4 men had murdered Deegan: Peter Limone, Henry Temelio, Joe Salvati, and Louis Greco. All 4 were connected to the Patriarca family. All 4 were innocent of this particular crime. All 4 were convicted and sentenced accordingly. Temelio and Greco died in prison. Salvati was released in 1997 after serving 30 years. Limone was released in 2001. When the full truth of what had happened finally emerged through later proceedings, a federal judge awarded the 4 men and the estates of the 2 who had died in prison a combined judgment of $101.7 million against the federal government. U.S. District Judge Nancy Gertner, who issued the ruling in 2007, found that the FBI had deliberately withheld evidence that would have exonerated the men and had allowed the perjured testimony to stand. The judgment remains one of the largest ever entered against the federal government in a wrongful conviction case. When Rico was called before a congressional committee in October 2003 to answer questions about the 4 wrongful convictions, a Republican congressman accused him of feeling no remorse. Rico's response, delivered in the hearing room, was, "What do you want, tears?" He was 78 years old. The second set of facts involves Roger Wheeler. Wheeler was a wealthy Oklahoma businessman who owned the Telex Corporation and had purchased World High Lie, a Florida-based gambling company. Rico had retired from the FBI in 1975 and taken a job as vice president of security at World High Lie, meaning he was working for the company that Wheeler would later buy. Winter Hill Gang hitman John Martirano testified that the gang believed Wheeler had discovered they were skimming approximately $1 million per year from World High Lie's profits and was preparing to act on that knowledge. On May 27, 1981, Wheeler was walking to his car after a round of golf at the Southern Hills Country Club in Tulsa. Martirano shot him once in the head.
Wheeler was 55 years old.
Martirano later testified that Rico had provided him with a physical description of Wheeler, the make and license plate number of his car, and his home address. Rico, according to Martirano's account, had passed this information through an intermediary. It was the kind of targeting package that allowed a hitman to identify and kill a specific person he had never met. Martirano admitted to firing the shot. Rico denied everything. His position was that Martirano's testimony was the self-serving account of a convicted murderer seeking leniency on his own charges, and that there was no credible physical evidence connecting him to any planning of the murder. His supporters, including retired FBI agents who later wrote a book arguing he had been wrongly accused, contended that the case against him was built entirely on the testimony of men who had every reason to invent a corrupt federal agent as part of their own cooperation deals. In October 2003, a Tulsa grand jury indicted Rico on murder charges connected to Wheeler's death. He was arrested at his home near Miami. He was 78 years old and in failing health. He was held in custody while legal proceedings began. Attempts by his attorney to secure bail or delay proceedings due to his deteriorating condition were unsuccessful. He was moved from custody to a Tulsa hospital as his health declined. He died on January 16, 2004, before any trial or preliminary hearing could take place. He was never convicted of anything connected to the Wheeler murder. The indictment died with him. What the documented record leaves behind is this: 4 innocent men lost a combined total of many decades in prison because Rico allowed false testimony to stand in a case where the FBI possessed evidence of the truth. 2 of those men died before they could be exonerated. The federal government paid $101.7 million because of what Rico and his colleagues did in that case. A congressional committee questioned him about it to his face, and his answer was to ask whether they wanted him to cry. Whether he also helped organized crime kill a businessman in Oklahoma was never decided in a courtroom. That question died in a Tulsa hospital in January 2004. What did not die was the record of what he demonstrably did, and the federal judgment that resulted from it stands as the financial measure of the damage one compromised agent inside the right position can produce. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.